Chapter 2. On Long Island. The morning sun had settled well in the sky. It casted a bright beam in the girls' room from the east end, exposing the chocolate-coloured walls, ceiling and floor. The room was vast, riddled with cabinets, desks and couches. There was ash spread on the floor near the fireplace, which shaped imprints of feet and bums from last night's occupancy. Besides the furniture, the room also hosted a few dozen bunk beds, some 3 beds high. All of them were empty, except for one. On the lowest bunk near the windowless end of the room occupied Betty. Even with sun beaming at the back of her head, combined with the sound of thundering footsteps and voices muffling across the closed door, she was unaffected, fast asleep and snoring softly. The door suddenly burst open, which gleamed the bright white walls of the hallway outside into the room. 2 figures trampled in. "Where is she?" Paddy demanded. Thorny pointed at the lone sleeper. They rushed to her bedside. "Betty, wake up!" Paddy yelled. She woke up as though shocked by an eel. What? "Why did you sleep in?" Paddy said. "I forgot to set an alarm." "You couldn't hear the alarms from the others?" "I guess not," Betty mumbled while yawning. "Didn't you remember the ceremonial exit this morning?" "I didn't think it was this early," Betty said, checking her watch on a cabinet next to her bed. "We've got no time, I'll help you get ready. Thorny, start packing her stuff." Thorny ran towards the lone set of suitcases, opened up with a mess all over the floor. "Don't lose anything, Thorny!" Betty yelled as she got out of bed. She tried to approach her, but her older sister pushed her away. "You're not doing this," Paddy said. "Let's go." The whole family, which was roughly 200, stood in 2 lines facing each other, creating a pathway between them from the house all the way to the large gravel patch. The gravel pit hosted a black vehicle among an endless line of similarly looking ones that stretched on a gravel path off in the distance. They stood there in silence. The air was dry, the morning sun sweltering hot, and the wind completely absent. The patriarch of the family was always the first one to leave, and everyone had to be present for their departure. This was tradition, as her parents put it, but Betty had the inclination it was just a way for one of her ancestors to punish their descendants. Probably from a grudge, even a joke if they were sick enough. Everyone wore black waistcoats with gold trim. The men wore white trousers, while the ladies, white wool dresses with golden trim flowing from waist to bottom. Both wore black loafers and capote hats with golden locks in the front. Betty appreciated the shade the hat gave her, but the wool dress, in her opinion, was a stupid decision. This ancestor was quite sick, yet cunning. Beside her stood her sisters, Paddy on her left and Thorny on the right. They were exact copies of each other, white blonde hair, frost blue eyes, and the best smiles of the Grimes, their parents and many others claimed. The exemplary Grimes ladies, they were usually called, mostly Paddy since she was older. But Betty? They simply referred to her as lovely, cute or unique. She didn't look much different than the others of the family. She had golden blonde hair and light brown eyes like most of them, though her hair was much curlier than most. Perhaps that's why they called her unique. The adults stood still as guards closer at the house, only looking around when necessary. Betty could figure out the parents of each respective child, as each act of misbehaviour would warrant a reaction from them. "Grimes family!" A voice boomed from the entrance of the house. "I present to you Ellen and Benyota Grimes." The old couple exited the house with the support staff opening a large black umbrella above, following them while they gracefully made their way down the line. The family members attempted smiles as they passed. "Come on," Betty thought. Her mind was focused on the air-conditioned vehicle coming after all of this. "Go faster." The old couple was halfway down when a dark-haired woman looked desperate to see them. "Excuse me, Ellen and Benyota," the woman said. "Bugger," Betty whispered. Paddy looked at her. "What is it, dear?" Benyota said in her very frail voice. "I'm so sorry to disturb, but my daughter Clara was pleading with me to get the chance to talk to you." "Is that so?" Benyota said. "No. Why is this allowed?" Betty whispered. Paddy looked at her briefly. "Just be patient, Betty." Benyota bent down to the young girl's level. The young girl gave her a red rose. She was down there for a while. Betty stared aghast at the fact that a 7-year-old could hold a conversation that long. "We're gonna die of heat exhaustion," Betty whispered. "Betty, Mum's watching," Paddy whispered while staring with her best smile forward. Betty glimpsed near the house and saw her mum's eyes squint at her. Her immediate reaction was to look forward and stand as still as a rock. Eventually, after what felt like 10 minutes, the heartfelt conversation between the girl, dark-haired lady and Benyota ended, and the couple began making their way between the lines once again. As they passed Betty and her sisters, they all tried to give the couple the biggest smiles they could muster. Betty was praying they wouldn't stop at anyone else. Reaching the black car that welcomed them with an open door, they both looked back and waved. Everyone turned and waved back. The path between the house and their car had now broken into a crowd as they approached the vehicle. The old couple then made their way into the vehicle and drove off, leaving a small cloud of dust behind. Once the vehicle was far enough, the whole family all started to clap. Many began loosening their collars, while others took off their hats. Amidst the crowd of the family, the 3 girls made their way to their parents. "Girls, before we leave, I need to talk to someone," their father said as they met them. "Just give us the keys, Dad," Betty begged. Their father rummaged through his pocket. Betty did her best not to look at her mother. She could feel her disapproving stare. "Here it is." He tossed the keys to Paddy. "Let's go, Paddy." Betty grabbed Paddy by the wrist and pulled her towards the line of cars. "Betty, what's up with you?" "Which one is it?" Paddy said, looking at the similar-looking black vehicles in the line. "There it is." Betty pointed to a black Ford station wagon. "How can you tell?" "Our car has green dice on the mirrors." She then ran towards the vehicle. Among the other very similar-looking vehicles, it indeed had green dice dangling on the rear-view mirror post. They were large and fuzzy and noticeable from the row of ubiquity. "Really?" Paddy said before following. "I never noticed when we came here." As Betty reached the rear door, she began pulling on the handle repeatedly and aggressively. "Geez, Betty, could you calm down?" Betty ignored, continuing on the metal door handle as Paddy worked on unlocking the front door. As soon as the rear doors unlocked, Betty threw herself in and landed on the side seats of the vehicle. "Turn it on!" Betty demanded. The car rumbled to life. The sound of fans whirring never brought more relief to Betty than it did at that moment. Thorny calmly sat next to her sister and closed the door behind. Thorny then grabbed a book in the large built-in cabinet attached to the back of the driver's seat and began reading. From the driver's side bench seat, Paddy looked back at Betty, leaning on the upholstery. "You really hate it here, don't you?" Paddy said. Betty gave her a quick glimpse and then went back down, lying on the bench seat. "It was hot outside." "Yeah, but we were only out for about 15 minutes. 15 minutes too long." Paddy sighed. "Why are you so desperate to leave? These gatherings only happen 7 times in our lifetimes. 10 if we're lucky. I'll be nearly 30 the next one. I'll probably have a kid or 2 and you might have a boyfriend." "Betty, a boyfriend?" Thorny snickered. "Tell that to Ellum and Benyota. This might well have been their 100th. I'm sure they get bored of it." "You find it boring?" Paddy reacted. "You're with family here, don't you love them?" "I hate it here." Paddy then rolled herself over the front bench seat and made her way on the other side of the bench, flanking Betty on her right. "Is there something wrong?" Paddy said. Betty didn't look back at her, but kept her focus on the velvet car ceiling. "No, nothing. I just wished you talked to me." "Am I not?" Betty snapped. "Could you guys not talk so loud?" They both looked at their younger sister, her eyes still on her book. "And Betty, stop taking all the bench." The cabin now cooled to a crisp as they waited. The 2 girls sat in silence while the youngest continued reading. Lying on the passenger bench, Betty was reminded of her large, cool bed back home. She'd be away from here and back there very soon. "Looks like you need a bed," Paddy said, staring down at Betty. Paddy then leaned forward, looking at the front dashboard. "I don't know which button increases cabin space." It was a wonderful idea. Betty quickly got up and met her sister. "Let's figure it out," Betty said, reaching for the buttons immediately to the right of the steering wheel. Just as she attempted to click the nearest one, Paddy quickly grabbed her collar and pulled her back on the car bench. "I'd rather Dad figure it out than you," Paddy reacted. After a brief shock from the violent action, Betty glared at her sister. She then looked at the 2 green fuzzy dice dangling on the car rearview mirror. It was the only thing Betty liked about the car aside the air conditioner. It wasn't only her favourite colour, but one of the only things her mother ever complimented her on when they bought it. She agreed on the colour as well. Within time, their parents came, their dad on the driver's seat while their mum on the passenger. They both looked back to see all 3 of them. "Anything interesting happened while we were gone?" their father said. Thorny gave a quick glimpse at her parents before going back to her book. "Dad, could you add the bed?" Betty pleaded. "Of course, dear." He pressed a button from the large panel, 3 right on the second row of 5. The rear cabin suddenly increased to 3 times its size. The passenger bench the girls were on suddenly transformed into a section couch. Paddy immediately made her way near the edge to lie down. Betty made her way towards the back, where a full-sized bed was waiting. It was similar in colour as the velvet car interior, but it was equipped with blankets and pillows. Behind the bed, a huge pile of the family's belongings. Betty collapsed on the bed. It smelled like home. Finally, they were headed home. In coordination, the cars began driving in line towards the exit of the large property, going through the wide gravel forest path. Eventually, they reached more open fields. On their left, the herd of horses followed across the fence of the gravel path, with their magical leader leading. Thorny pointed while tapping Paddy on the shoulder. "Look, Betty, Perficephus," Paddy yelled at her. Betty stared across the window. It was Perficephus looking as beautiful as he did. She then remembered his portrait. She still had to fix him. But that was for later. The bed was too comfortable. The car made it past the Grimes Ranch gates and headed left on the tarmac road. Cars in front of them began rising up into the air, the bottom of them showing the sky above rather than the vehicle components. It was their turn. The father pressed the second button on the 4th row. The car leaned up, causing the sound of wheels on tarmac suddenly to disappear with only wind to occupy the cabin. The car then rose, causing a little shuffling of things at the back. Paddy and Betty placed themselves near the edges of the couch and bed, and Thorny placed her book higher in front of her. The green dice dangled towards them. In front of both parents, other vehicles flew in the same direction with the blue sky taking all the view of the windscreen. The cars then reached level flight. The horizon was visible once again. Betty quickly got up from the bed to look at the scenery. Wyoming looked much better up here. It turned out Betty wasn't as tired as she thought she was. Her focus was on the velvet roof, her mind void of anything now. The car jostled around while above the clouds, the tyres streaking the surface, leaving tyre trails of cloud mist as the car passed. At this point of the journey, most of the Grimes families have gone their separate ways, leaving Betty and her family alone in the vehicle in the air. The sun had begun to sink west. As Betty looked up from the bed, she was suddenly blinded by the sun's rays from the 2 mirrors in the front. They headed into a large grey cloud, lighting flashes piercing through the opaque fog. As they entered, the bright yellow sunbeams diffused into grey. Gentle streams of water droplets began hitting all sides of the car. The car shook more violently, but still flew firm. It was perfect. The cradling of the vehicle and the sound of the water droplets were enough to put someone asleep. Betty suddenly felt the weight of her eyes overwhelm her. Finally, some sleep. "We're almost home, girls," their father bellowed behind. Both Paddy and Thorny rose their heads from books while Betty slowly rose from her nap. She then looked around, the sky replaced by a dark navy blue, the moon the brightest thing in the sky. "Look, it's New York," Thorny said, pointing at the left window. Father Grimes turned the wheel left. No one except Thorny prepared for what came next. Mother Grimes tumbled on their father while Paddy on Thorny. Betty was less lucky, finding herself tumbling towards the window, landing face flat on its surface. "Franklin, have you gone insane?" Mother Grimes reacted, pushing herself back. It was indeed New York as Betty gazed through the glass, the sea of endless yellow lights beaming from the surface, low flying clouds reflecting it back. The car suddenly turned right side up, tumbling Paddy, Betty and Mother Grimes towards the right. "Sorry, girls, I got carried away," Father Grimes said. "Franklin, has Hamilton changed you?" their mother said. The surface was less noticeable, but based on the shapes of the island, Betty knew they were just above Brooklyn. "There's Queens," Betty said, looking at the set of yellow sprinkles right where they were. "And this is where we begin our descent," Father Grimes said. He pressed a button third right on the second row of 5. The car began to jitter as they descended. Things were becoming more visible, more life-sized. Father Grimes then began mimicking noises of a radio. "Attention, passengers. We expect this landing will be rough. We highly urge you all to buckle up and prepare for the inevitable." The 3 girls followed suit. Paddy adjusted herself to sit at the far right, while Betty moved up to sit between the 2. With a press of a button, the car shrunk to its normal size, slightly pushing the 3 closer together. They then all buckled up. The distant yellow lights of the metropolis began to disappear as they neared the surface, being blocked by passing buildings and trees. The white headlights of the vehicle then began reflecting back at them on the dark tarmac surface. The car shook slightly as the tyres contacted the road, the sound of tyres rolling returning once again in the cabin. "And we've landed. Remember to gather your belongings and exit in a single file line. Thank you for flying air, Grimes." "Every time, Frankie?" Mother Grimes said. They continued on the lonely, curvy forest road. Through the trees flanking right of them, the dark waters of Great South Bay appeared, reflecting the moonlight. They eventually arrived at a set of wrought iron gates which, upon approach, let them through. As they made their way up the cobblestone path, the home appeared in view. It was large, surrounding a cobblestone courtyard. The car lights reflected the dark, wooden exterior of the home with the occasional gold trim. It was not much different from the humble home in Wyoming, though much, much larger. As soon as the car came to a stop, the girls all rushed out the vehicle. Betty began spiraling with her arms out in celebration. The humidity hit her. Finally, home. They approached the front door. "Now, what was the password?" Paddy began tapping the front door knob with her wand. "Pufferfish? No. Ultracorn? No." "Wasn't it ferret?" Betty remarked. "No, it was Donna," Thorny reacted. "Ferret? Dolphin? Ultracorn, what is it?" Paddy said, staring back at them, but she didn't look at her wand as she tapped the doorknob once more. It twisted sporadically before vibrating. "That's not good," Paddy said, slowly moving away. The doorknob then suddenly collapsed into multiple pieces on the floor, leaving a hole where it once was. Paddy slowly approached the door and pushed it. "Well, it's open," Paddy said anxiously. A pair of heavy footsteps approached the girls. Paddy quickly levitated with her wand all the broken doorknob pieces into a nearby bush. "Oh, so one of you did remember the passkey," Father Grimes said. Yeah," Paddy lied. "But just to make sure, what was it?" Father Grimes scoffed. "I can't tell you while we're outside. You might not know who's listening. I don't even trust the bees that attend the bushes here. But since at least one of you knows it, why tell?" As Father Grimes made his way towards the door, Paddy placed herself near the hole and opened the door for her father, keeping eye contact with him. The 2 girls followed him, Betty behind Thorny. Betty gave Paddy a face of pity while passing. The 2 girls, along with their father, made their way up the stairs. Betty looked around her room and sighed in relief. Things were barely noticeable in the dark, but by memory, Betty made her way to her bed and flopped. The smell was an obvious sign of fresh laundry. "Thank you, Janetta," Betty whispered. Footsteps approached her room. Her father poked his head in. "Betty, you need help with your things," he said. Betty looked back at him in the darkness. "Sure, Dad." "Okay, I'll get them right now." Father Grimes took out his wand. "Actio, Betty's suitcases," he said while gesturing with it. There was a brief silence. "Wait for it," Father Grimes said. More silence. Betty got out of her bed in excitement. "Wait for it." The sound of things crashing into the walls started echoing down the stairs. It became louder and louder when suddenly 3 large suitcases flew at tremendous speeds into the room. Betty leapt to the floor as they flew above her head. The sound of glass crashing, wood cracking and metal clanging echoed in the room. Both of them didn't have any idea where the suitcases landed. "Oh dear, Betty, I'm sorry." Betty smiled. "Don't worry about it, Dad." He then flicked the lights on to see the aftermath. It was the beige cabinet, its glass shattered and now was in pieces on its wooden surface and the floor while 2 of the 4 drawers buckled in. "I'll fix it later, dear," Father Grimes said before heading to another room. As Betty approached the suitcases, she noticed that only one of the 3 belonged to her. She opened hers and rummaged through it. Thorny did a terrible job with the packing. "Yes, they're here." Betty took her green full-set pyjamas and headed to her closet in the corner. She was in relaxing clothing once again, her dark brown slippers keeping her feet comfortable. As she approached the door, she heard her dad casting the same spell from a distance. "Actio! Paddy suitcases!" Betty was smart to stay away from the door. The sound of things moving through the house became louder, and soon enough, a few large suitcases flew in the hallway towards Father Grimes. It made an impact like Betty's, but much louder, probably much more expensive. "By Hamilton's grace, why again?" Betty heard his voice echoing in the hallway. She looked both ways to make sure the coast was clear and then headed downstairs. Betty held her cup of warm milk in her hands while sitting on the living room couch, staring through the large sliding patio doors. Rather than the usual darkness their residence was so used to, the bright glow of the moonlight casted mint green everywhere immediately from the patio platform. It was on the grass, trees, and dark trunks of those trees. Coupled with the flickering of moonlight on the water surface of Great South Bay, past the tree line not far from their home, it was serene. The house had settled as her father gave up on summoning their belongings. She smelled the charcoal left from a fire in the fireplace earlier that evening, mixed with the strong pine. It was moments like this that Betty enjoyed about home. The sound of cracking was calming. If it were winter, she would have a blanket, but it wasn't that cold yet, not for another couple of months. The sound of gentle footsteps and wood creaking echoed in the living room. Betty quickly looked over and saw her older sister in her nightgown. "Hey, Betty," she said. Betty grinned. Paddy then sat next to her on the couch. "What you've got there?" "Something to calm me down," Betty said. "I don't understand you and your warm milk. I feel it's like something Nana Kalsko would do." "What do you mean?" Betty reacted. "Sometimes I feel like you're an old soul in a young body." "Thanks, Paddy," Betty said before drinking the warm milk. "Why aren't you in bed?" "Can't sleep. I slept in the car like you nearly the whole way home." "So I'm stuck with you for another couple of hours then?" Paddy chuckled. "You're gonna love Thermadore." "You really think so?" Betty took another sip of her milk. "Of course. The teachers, the Elementa games, the courses, nothing comes near it." "Not even Ilvermorny," Betty said. She took another sip of the warm milk. Paddy sighed. "I think that school is overrated." "Not Mum. I've never seen her so happy with Thorny's acceptance letter." "Well, that's Mum," Paddy said. "She didn't react the same way when I got my acceptance letter to Thermadore. She just shrugged," Betty said. "I was very excited about it, Betty." "Yeah. You were even getting emotional." "Of course I was. You were one of only a few Grimes to set foot in Thermadore. That acceptance letter was history." Betty smiled at her. "Paddy, to be honest, I never really cared to learn more about the school since that acceptance letter. Could you give me a rundown?" Paddy looked ecstatic. "Of course. I have so much to say. Where do I start?" "There's the school itself. It was founded by the Thermadores back in some time in the 19th century. Paddy rambled on like a salesperson. It was complete nonsense coming out her mouth. Betty continued to gaze at Paddy, showing as much interest as possible as she talked. Betty thought about how different it would be. She'd be in Pittsburgh, so far away from home. If she couldn't handle the family reunion, how would she handle school? "Mr. Concora has the history of the American Revolution, known like you've never seen. I swear he somehow was able to time travel. And there's Mrs. Alexandra." There was so much How could Paddy know all that in a span of 5 years attending the school? The headmaster can be a pain in the butt since he prioritises the school's reputation, but he's somewhat likeable. Oh, and there's this new teacher, just started on my last year. Soon enough, words became mumbles, and hand expressions dwindled. Betty checked the clock above the fireplace and noticed an hour had passed since Paddy sat next to her. Then Paddy's head slouched on the couch. She had somehow tired herself out, explaining Thermadore. Betty placed her empty cup on the coffee table and quietly made her way upstairs to Paddy's room. She grabbed the blanket from her bed and slowly made her way downstairs. She covered Paddy, gave her a hug, and made her way back upstairs to her room. As Betty flopped on her own bed, she tried processing all the information Paddy dumped, so little actually retained in her head. Ilvermorny was where she wanted to go. It's where all the kids in her neighbourhood wanted to as well. Both her parents had gone there. Why couldn't her, and why couldn't her older sister? As much as Paddy promoted Thermadore, it wasn't Ilvermorny. Yellow light beams diffused into the room and veils around Betty's bed. This time, it was enough to wake her up. Placing herself on the side of the bed, she puts on her slippers and stretched. Outside her floor-to-ceiling window across her bed, the grass and leaves on the tree glowed from the morning sun, the sky a bright turquoise. Betty made her way to the centre of her room. There she stood on a round indent, looking up at the round skylight. Turquoise greeted her. She noticed on her left, the cabinet that fell victim to suitcases wasn't damaged anymore. It was as though they weren't affected in the first place. She made her way out her room and down the stairs. The smell of something sweet overwhelmed her. She ran to the only room that could leave such a scent. There it was, heaven. The kitchen table had everything: warm, soft pancakes, waffles, eggs of all sorts, boiled, scrambled, sunny side up, a large assortment of fruits, but Betty wasn't interested in that. "Morning, Betty!" A dark-haired woman in bright blue gowns with a white apron walked in the kitchen. Tin cans, pots and small bags floated around her, following. "Morning, Janetta, you're back early." The lady smiled. "Frobot was missing home badly. I couldn't stand to see him like that, so I thought I'd come today." Betty was glad to see another friendly face in the home. Betty went through the assortments of breakfast materials: scrambled eggs, 3 pancakes, and a large cup of hot chocolate. The lady then quickly ran to Betty's plate and placed 3 large strawberries on it. Betty gave her a confused look. "Just something to even out your meal," the lady remarked. "Fine," Betty said begrudgingly. With her arms taken up by breakfast, she made her way to the backyard and headed for a nearby table on the patio. She then made herself comfortable and indulged. Janetta came outside and placed a cup near Betty. She leaned over on the house walls, looking at the forest past the shallow lawn. "Your dad, Paddy and Thorny went on a morning walk. They didn't want to disturb your sleep. Your mother just left just as you ran downstairs." Betty simply nodded and continued indulging in her breakfast. Janetta, looking at her, pushed the cup towards her. "It's apple juice." Betty winced. "Had enough of this." She pushed the apple juice away and back towards Janetta. It was quite smart for Paddy to keep the discarded portraits of Perphicephus now that she nearly completed her recent and best one yet. With them all placed on her desk, surrounding the central one bounded by leather, all she needed to do was select the one that had the most convincing head, neck, and hooves. With careful tracing and a patient Perphicephus, she restored back the creature's beady eyes, snout, ears, and neck. The hooves came next, in which the creature immediately stood up as soon as she finished. It then neighed. I know, you're missing your alicorn." She then traced 2 lines up between its eyes, giving it a respectable length. "Try your new head, Perphicephus." The horse drew its head down towards the grass below. "Yes!" Betty yelled, as the creature indulged in the black-inked plant. As it ate, it pranced around the canvas, moving its head up and down excitedly. "My goodness, what have we got here?" Janetta entered her room and observed the portrait. "Has anyone else seen it?" the maid said. Betty looked up at her. "Paddy, though it was worst before." I'm sure your parents will love it. Betty turned her focus back on the portrait. Perphicephus now stood proudly with his drawn-on mane flowing in the wind. After countless attempts in Wyoming, she finally made something she was proud of. Your dad is in the front. He was wondering if you want to come walk with them to the beach. They're not done? It seems they aren't. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. The weather is great. Betty nodded and headed towards her closet. Ginetta stood watching as she closed the curtain and began rummaging through clothes. Betty launched herself out the curtains and presented herself towards the maid. Light blue jeans, a light green sweater and black boots. And don't forget, Ginetta flicked her wand. A white handband flew straight from the closet to her open hand. She adjusted it on Betty's head. The white band slowly disappeared in her curls, which emphasized her bangs. You look just like your mother, Ginetta said. I do? Of course. But the only things we have in common is our golden hair and brown eyes, Betty said. Ginetta smiled. Once you get back, I'll show you a picture of your mother when she was around your age. She would rather not have everyone see it, but since you're her closest-looking daughter, I think you get a right. Betty ran towards Ginetta and hugged her. Glad you're back. Me too, now let's hurry. We don't want your dad and sisters waiting. As they approached the front door, Betty noticed Father Grimes attending it. She gasped. Ginetta looked at her. Hey, Ginetta. Hey, Betty, he said. Hello, Dad. Ginetta approached him. I've checked the property with the girls. Looks like we're clear, he said to the maid. I've checked the house. No signs of break-in, she said. He then looked around the door. I just don't understand why someone would break the lock and steal nothing. Is this vandalism? Betty kept her mouth shut, focusing on the paintings on the wall. Anyways, I'll work on that later. Betty, you're ready? Betty made her way through the door, passing the two adults, attempting to ignore the hole where the door lock was. If Vivian comes, tell her we're not long, Father Grimes said to the maid. She nodded. On the cobblestone courtyard, Betty felt the full strength of the sun on her. Maybe the green sweater was a bit much. Both her sisters stood waiting for her. Next to them, a dark brown and white Jarvey ran towards her. Frobot! Betty yelled while crouching at its level. Third sister! The creature yelled back at her. She hugged the creature. How are you, third sister? Third sister? I thought I was second sister, Betty said. You're third sister because I organised my numbers with who I saw first and then counted up after for today, the small Jarvey explained. Betty chuckled. We were gone too long, I think. Father Grimes waved by at Ginetta and approached his daughters. Come on, girls, to the beach. Once we made it to the edge of the property, Paddy suddenly got the suspicion we were being followed. Dad didn't think so we continued on the road. Paddy got really worried. Dad insisted we were safe. But Paddy was right all along. A large, grey, gripen wolf with 4 tails approached behind us. Dad said to stand back, and we did. Dad then took out his wand. Disiento! Dad yelled. A flash of green blinded us all. Once we opened our eyes, the gripen wolf was gone. We thought we were safe, but we heard on our left. It stared at us with its creepy yellow eyes and drooled. It jumped for us, but Paddy used a shield charm. Dad then ran past us and started casting stunning spells at it. I then took Paddy's wand from her hand and yelled, Exico Maxima! And the gripen wolf hit the ground dead. I stopped the wolf. I saved us all. Thorny was proud of her explanation of the events that took place. Betty then looked at Paddy. Is that true? Did you all nearly die from a gripen wolf? Father Grimes nodded. And Thorny saved you guys? Paddy looked back. Well, not all true. Yes, we were being followed. Thorny had a wand. She had a wand, Betty reacted, and did magic. Well, if you count a random stick on the ground as a wand, then yes. And she did use that curse, Paddy said. Really? Betty reacted. Yes, she did, and I'm disappointed that she thinks she has the right mind to use it, Father Grimes said, looking at his youngest. Thorny glared at Paddy and her father. And the gripen wolf was Frobot, Paddy added. I was just pretending, okay? Thorny puffed out. I wanted our morning walk to be interesting." "And interesting it was," Frobot said. The Grimes with their Jave continued down the makeshift path through the forest, with the white sand and deep blue oceans slowly becoming visible through the tree line. As they passed the last few trees before the beach, the white sand briefly blinded them. Paddy, Thorny and Frobot then made their way to shallow waves foaming up near the edge of the sand. Betty felt her father's hands hold firm on her shoulders. "Betty, before you go, I wanted to ask you something." He bent down at her level. "Is everything all right, dear?" "I'm fine," Betty responded while looking at him. "Betty, I want you to know that I love you. Nothing you do will change that. If you need anything, please tell me." She looked away briefly. "Maybe there's one thing." "What is it?" "Why does Mum not love me anymore?" He was taken aback. "Betty, where are you getting this?" "Of course she loves you." Betty then stared back at him. She couldn't resist those eyes. It was exactly like Paddy's. "Janetta said I looked exactly like Mum. Is that true?" Father Grimes chuckled. "I'm surprised Janetta told you that. Mum's trying her best to keep that a secret." "But why? Should I be ashamed?" "How about we sit here?" he said, guiding her. They both sat on the soft sand, near the tree line, gazing at the girls splashing water at each other. "Well, you know, your mum and I were in the same house in Ilvermorny, Thunderbird House. When she was chosen during my 3rd year, I didn't think much of her. I was at a grade level high enough to think less of the newer students that weren't quadpot players or in leadership positions, the forgettables we called them." Betty smiled. "She hates it when you call her that." "Yes, and I should stop. It wasn't until 2 years later that things changed. There was this sponsored dance at the school." "You had a date with a girl named Danica Flatwick," Betty added. "Good to see you still remember the details. I planned to go with her, but my friend Freddie and I, with a group of friends, heard of an experimental potion that could enhance someone's abilities past their imaginations. As quadpot players, we took a liking to it since it could get us another championship win for Ilvermorny on a decade-winning streak." "So cheating was the only option?" Betty said. Father Grimes chuckled. "We were naive teenagers who thought it was all for the greater good of the school. I don't know how it happened, but I was the one tasked to go alone through the potions class and find this experimental potion. We heard it was in a silver bottle." "So you trusted rumours that this potion was in a silver bottle? What if it was something else?" Betty said. "Again, we were stupid, but we were desperate. So instead of going to the dance, I sneaked in the classroom, looking for the suitcase where most of the prohibited potions were. I had the sense I was being followed since noises would erupt around me as soon as I stood silent. Then I found it on the teacher assistant's desk. And Mum was there too, right?" "Exactly," Father Grimes beamed. "What was she going for, Dad?" Betty asked. He thought hard. "You know, to this day I don't know." "So you were caught right after?" Betty said. We both looked at each other shocked. All we knew was that we were going for the exact same thing. I grabbed the suitcase first, but then your mum leaped on me and tried to grab it away. Since I was the bigger person, I managed to pull not only the suitcase but her. We both hit a cabinet nearby, which caused potions to fall right next to us. The sound of glass smashing on the floor is not the most gentle of noises. We hoped no one heard, but we were very wrong. "And then you had detention with Mum?" "Yes, both our parents got called. The potions teacher encouraged the headmaster to have us both get expelled, but the headmaster insisted we stay. We were both relieved to hear this, but our punishment was to spend the rest of our weekday evenings during that year cleaning the potions class." "That's when you started talking to Mum?" He chuckled. "Yes. When the teacher was gone, we would argue on who was to blame. But we realised that didn't matter. We slowly became friends after that. I then fell in love with her in my last year. I waited until she graduated for me to pop the question, and now look where that has brought me today. I got Paddy, Thorny, you and your mum. I couldn't be more grateful." "Such a weird way you two met," Betty added. "But kinda sweet." They then both looked forward. Both Paddy and Thorny were now battling in the water. Paddy, having the advantage of magic, did the most damage. "Did Mum look like me, or was she pretty?" Betty said. Father Grimes scoffed. "Both of you are gorgeous. When I look at you right now, I see the exact same face of young Vivian Calsco smiling after I told her a dark secret about the potions teacher. Betty, you're beautiful. Don't ever forget that, dear." Betty felt overwhelmed and embraced her father in a hug. "I love you, Betty. I guess Thermadore won't be the same without houses," Betty said grimly. Father Grimes grabbed Betty's hands. "I don't know much about Thermadore, but your sister has told me wonderful things." He looked back at his daughters out on the shoreline. "I'm sorry they only accepted your younger sister for Ilvermorny, but I know you'll do good in Thermadore. My Betty always does good." The girls and Frobot approached the two sitting on the sand. They were completely soaked from attacking each other in the water. "What happened?" Father Grimes demanded. Both girls panted. Paddy, recovering quicker, opened her mouth. "I accidentally splashed Thorny while checking the water. I apologised, but she insisted I did it on purpose." "She did!" Thorny yelled. Paddy gave her a stern look. "It simply got out of hand, that's all." Father Grimes looked at Thorny's attire, once bright, clean and dry. Now she looked like she took a dive in the ocean. He winced, realising the cost of Thorny's clothes. "Well, what will Mum think?" Paddy wondered. "Think? It's more like what she'll do. I think you won't see me for a while," their father said sarcastically.